Admiral Mike Rogers, of course, the former director of the National Security Agency. It's so nice to see you, Mike.
Thanks.
How are things in Munich so far? What's the tone this year?
Clearly lots of angst around this idea of what is the future in Ukraine, what is the role of Europe, what is the U.S. strategy, are they linked, how is Ukraine itself going to be involved in all this, what's the Russians' dimension to all this, just a lot of uncertainty, and quite frankly, a lot of angst and a little bit of agitation among particularly the Europeans at the moment.
Yeah, it seemed that the speech by the Vice President J.D. Vance didn't go over so well in Europe because the focus, a lot of folks we've talked to here have said the focus seemed to be on criticizing the allies and not necessarily on embracing or understanding or communicating the threat from Russia. Is that concerning? Do you agree with that? Do you disagree? How did you take that?
Well, first, I think we had two different sets of expectations. I was in the audience. I think the audience's view, particularly among the European elements within the audience, was they were going to hear an American leader lay out a vision for Ukraine going forward, as well as trying to talk about the broader dynamics of the U.S.-European relationship. And that's not what they heard. Instead, what they got was a U.S. view of domestic issues, if you will, in Europe, which left a lot of Europeans here scratching their head about, well, this isn't what we thought. And it seemed to be as if you were attacking us because we were not embracing your political views about information, immigration, etc. I think a lot of Europeans found that both frustrating and unsettling.
It's interesting because there will be an after action report on this and to see whether that was the right speech for the right time and the right audience. But there are a lot of things going on there. Like you mentioned right off the top, the future of Ukraine, Europe's common security. How are you hearing sort of these conversations and with folks that you're talking to on the sidelines about how Europe may now be rethinking its future collective security with or without the U.S.?
Right. So I think Europe, number one, is stepping back and asking itself, is what we are seeing out of the Americans, does this represent some sort of fundamental change and the Americans have a different view of their relationship with us? Is this something that's specific issue focused? Because remember, it's not just Ukraine. While Ukraine has been the focus here at the Munich Security Conference, not surprisingly, given the fact that it's a national security conference, we've also got significant issues around tariffs, trade, the economic dimensions. And I think many Europeans in general are asking themselves, so does this mean that we're going to have to create a different relationship with the Americans? If so, what would that relationship look like? What is our strategy, European strategy? I think there's a strong consensus that they're very agitated, unhappy, and uncertain, but I don't think there's a consensus yet about, so what should we do about it? I think that is where the focus of the moment is, what should we do about it?
Recognizing excellence in national security. The Cypher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cypherbriefhonors.com.
I'm curious to know if you've had the opportunity to engage with any of the members of the congressional delegations from the U.S. that have been there. Are they concerned about the Russia question? Because obviously Europe's very concerned about Russia. Obviously, the world is waiting to see whether the second Trump administration is going to be as cozy with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It seems like that's the direction we're headed in. What's the sort of level of concern there about whether that actually reflects the actual threat that Russia poses to both the U.S. and to Europe?
So I did get the opportunity to speak to several of them. I don't want to speak for them. My takeaway in those conversations, was broadly, they're trying to understand exactly what is the U.S. strategy and how is it going to play out. What is the nature of this administration's views of the dynamics with Russia? And I think also some questions about whether you agree or disagree. Hey, is this initial outreach the most effective strategy in terms of negotiating an outcome with the Russians?
Yeah. You were head of the NSA for a number of years, and I know that you've been very active in the private sector since you've retired too, and sort of understanding the threats that are out there in cyber. How much are people even talking about that now? And are those issues of cooperation in cyber being pushed to the sidelines because of some of these other headlines, or are they being actively addressed?
So cyber continues to be a clear dimension of security, both geopolitics as well as economic security. Prior to the start of the Munich Security Conference, which runs Friday afternoon until Sunday afternoon, Munich also hosts the Munich Cybersecurity Conference that runs from the Thursday to the Friday. And that is that is very much focused on cyber. And I attend both events. My takeaway from that Munich Cybersecurity Conference was lots of concern about, are the strategies that we've been using, have they been effective? If not, what do we need to do differently? And how might a different approach be shaped by concerns around, can you count on the U.S. as a partner? Are they going to embrace cybersecurity as a core area of interest, regardless of other things going on like Ukraine, tariffs, et cetera? I think the jury is still out on all that, to be honest.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that your assessment remains that the biggest nation states that are backing cyber attacks continue to be Russia, China, North Korea?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. The big four, we always used to talk about China, scale, as well as you look at Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, aggressiveness and risk calculation. They have really gotten more aggressive, being much more risky in the things they're doing. Russians, both in terms of scale and aggressiveness, but also the disinformation dimension for them has always been so large. The North Koreans and then the Iranians, the big four, plus criminal groups. And sadly, you see the dimensions between nation states and criminal groups starting to blur, where before we used to see them as very distinct, very separate. Now you clearly see relationships, you see them sharing tools, you see them sharing targets. That should really be of concern to us as we're trying to develop strategies.
Yeah, definitely concerning. What do you think, Admiral Rogers, your takeaway from this year's Munich Security Conference is going to be?
So we're in a period of great agitation or churn in the sense that Europeans don't like some of the things they're hearing. The thing that I am looking for is, okay, if you're unhappy, what is your counter strategy? What are you proposing to the U.S. as an alternative way ahead? If you don't like what the U.S. is laying out, which is certainly right, what's your plan? What would you do? How would you bring things together? It's not enough just to complain. You've got to come up with an alternative. And that's what I'm waiting for personally.
This is just a little note of my own, but it feels like just over the past decade or so, you've seen with a change in leadership in the U.S., some allies, traditional allies, have decided just to wait it out. Let's see if this administration is actually going to last, if they're going to set policies that go from one administration to the other. Do you feel like we're almost entering like a new age, Admiral, where you can't really rely on U.S. domestic politics anymore?
Now, I'm not ready to draw that conclusion yet. And excuse me, we got a helicopter flying overhead, so we'll give it a second here.
No problem.
So
you think U.S. allies are still planning long term?
No, I think they're trying to understand what they're seeing. I think they're at a, hey, this seems to be different. We want to understand how different. We want to understand, does this extend beyond just Ukraine? Is this something more foundational, something broader? Is there an economic dimension to it in addition to the traditional national security and geopolitical kinds of things?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear the helicopter behind you there. If you happen to see men coming out of ropes out of that helicopter, please let us know, and we can
check.
Part of the challenge.
Part of the challenge you're running into right now, Zelensky is arriving, and
so understood.
He's arriving to the hall. So,
well, I think this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and to share some of these insights. It's really helpful to get perspectives like yours to understand sort of what the mood and tone.
Jack, well, it's just one opinion.
Yeah. Mike Rogers, thank you so much for joining us today.
Suzanne, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks to your listeners.